This episode is sponsored by War Thunder. We take a closer look at the German Panzerkampfwagen IV Ausf G and the Soviet T-34 from 1942. And since even the specific variants of these tanks varied quite a bit, we take a look at them in their summer-fall 1942 configurations. As previously in the Panzer IV vs T-34 video, we will go beyond looking at just mere raw data and also qualify the data based on other qualifying factors. Note, we will stick to the technical tactical level, although at the end we look at the bigger picture as well. So let's look at the chosen criteria, namely firepower, ergonomics, visibility, armor protection, mobility, and communications. Yet unlike Zaloga, I don't consider crew training a factor, nor availability like Baryatinskiy does. I will just look on the technical level, as such we look at the finished tanks. Now why not include training? Well, there are various arguments here for and against it. One major issue is we actually know rather little about training, and it is sometimes quite different from unit to unit. For instance, some units of the 3rd US Armored Division really like the stabilizer in the M4 Sherman, while members of the 4th Armored Division thought it was rubbish. Additionally, we are assuming that the tank has a standard ammunition loadout, so no spamming of tungsten rounds for the Germans, and both tanks are properly maintained. So let's start with firepower. The Panzerkampfwagen IV Ausf G was equipped with a 75mm gun. Die 7,5 cm Kampfwagenkanone 40 L43, so the length of the gun was 43 times the caliber. Note, it is very important here that this is the L43, not the longer and more powerful L48, which was only introduced in April 1943. Whereas the T-34 in 1942 was equipped with the 76mm F-34 with a barrel length of 4.1 according to Zaloga or 4.5 according to Baryatinskiy. Now the Panzer IV values are for the Panzergranate 39, whereas for the T-34 the shell is the BR350A. So let's take a look at their penetration values against homogeneous armor at a 30-degree angle. As you can see, the Panzer IV values are higher. Note, for 500 meters for the Soviet gun I had two values, I displayed the higher one. The lower one is in parentheses. In terms of armor loadout, the Panzer IV had a total of 87 shells. Meanwhile, for the T-34 it was 77 rounds. In September 1942, Stalin ordered to increase the number to 100 shells, yet this likely took a while to take effect for several weeks or even months. But then again, firepower is a combination of various factors, for instance the quality of sights, gun stabilization and traverse speed. So let us look at the qualitative aspects. First off, one major drawback of the Panzer IV was the traverse speed of the turret. The maximum traverse speed of the turret with a powered system was 16 degrees per second. As such, it took 22.5 seconds for a 360-degree turn. In contrast, the T-34 could do this in 13.8 seconds, according to the British School of Tank Technology report. Additionally, it is noted that there is a considerable play and backlash in the gearing, making accurate laying difficult for the T-34. Be aware that the report is from February 1944, but the tank is an older model, likely from May-June 1942, according to Francis Pulham. The British also reviewed the Panzer IV turret traverse and noted, the maximum speed is relatively low, but the response is quick and the braking good. The chief shortcomings are A. Accurate control with the handwheel is difficult. B. The dead space is too wide. C. The number of resistance steps is too small, with the result that the characteristic is noticeably stepped, making it impossible to follow moving targets accurately, particularly at low angular speeds. As such, at very low ranges the T-34 had probably the edge, while at regular combat and longer distances I suspect the Panzer IV was better off. The further aspects are gun sights. The Panzer IV had the Turmzielfernrohr 5F, literally meaning turret target telescope 5F. It had a magnification of 2.5 and a field of view of 25 degrees. Zaloga notes for the T-34 that the TMFD-7 telescopic sight had also 2.5 magnification, but the field of view was 14.5 degrees. Probably more important is the fact that Zaloga notes that the quality of the Soviet lenses was below that of German devices, since Germany had a world-leading optics industry at the time. As such, in terms of optics, the Panzer IV definitely had the edge. So for firepower, the Panzer IV is ahead of the T-34. Additional sights at this point are clearly better than the Soviet sights. In terms of gun traverse, the T-34 was faster, but it seems it came with serious drawbacks as well. As such, in terms of firepower, the Panzer IV achieves the victory. Now a word from our sponsor here. Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this episode and providing in-game footage of the various historical vehicles currently modeled in the game. As you can see, I played it a bit myself over the years. War Thunder is free to play on PC, Xbox, PlayStation, and now also mobile. Just download and play. It is fully cross-platform, so PC players can shoot down console players and the other way. Additionally, there's now a new all-mobile version available on iOS and Android, so you can engage your enemies while being at the park. The mobile version features intuitive controls, impressive graphics, and the familiar massively multiplayer warfare in air, land, and sea battles. War Thunder is extremely comprehensive. It allows you to play more than 2,500 vehicles like tanks, aircraft, helicopters, and ships of 10 major nations from the 1920s to current day vehicles. The vehicles are all very detailed and modeled down to the various technical components that can also be damaged and affect gameplay. War Thunder models in general aim to be visually as historically accurate as possible, join over 70 million players in PvP battles today. Additionally, there are various game modes that allow newcomers to learn the basics, whereas veterans can play harder game modes. If you want to have a shot at or with me, be sure to use the links in the description, and if you play on PC or consoles, claim War Thunder Large Bonus Pack for new players and everyone returning that hasn't played for the last 6 months or longer, featuring multiple premium vehicles, premium account time, rentals, and a 3D decorator. Let's move on to armor protection. First, the numbers. For the Panzerkampfwagen IV Ausf G, we have the following numbers for armor thickness and effective armor ratings. Be aware that some Panzer IV G had an additional applique armor of 30mm at the front, but we are looking at summer-fall 1942, at which point it was only used in some cases. Only in 1943 it became standard. In comparison, here's the data for the T-34 according to Zaloga. Here the T-34 is the clear winner on the data side. Yet this is not the full part of the story. The quality of steel, the welding, and other manufacturing aspects affected the strength of the armor plates. For instance, Germany used mainly rolled armor for hulls and turrets. In general, rolled armor is about 15% better in resistance to shock and penetration than cast armor. However, this advantage is offset to some extent by the varying angles of obliquity and irregular shapes possible in castings. Most T-34s at this point had a turret that used cast armor, which would mean the turret were rather similarly armored, yet the hull was still better armored than the Panzer IV. For the Panzer IV, the British noted in their August 1943 report that there were some issues with the armor quality. Note that this tank likely was from 1942, since the frontal armor was still 50mm. Some signs of weld failure have appeared in the joints between the turret front and side plates. Cracks have occurred in the heat-affected zone alongside the weld. Generally, it seems there were no major issues with German armor quality at this point. Additionally, the armor scheme was matured and teething problems ironed out. The problem was that the Soviets for quite some time used steel that was not ideal for casting the turrets of the T-34. Another aspect was that the armor plates and manufacturing quality of the T-34 was often lackluster. The full-strength penetration welding used was different from the German approach and could severely affect the quality of the armor. In the process, because of overheating the armor around the weld joints and burning out of the carbon and alloy elements in it, the strength of the armor fell by 2 to 4 times. As a result, 37mm armor-piercing shells could penetrate the front hull of the early T-34 in the vicinity of the nose crossbeam and in other places where welded parts came together. Sometimes the welding could also lead to cracks within the armor. However, perhaps the main reason for the cracks was the low quality of the armor. The point is that the USSR at the time didn't have enough precise instruments to control the temperature and chemical composition of metal in the furnaces, and thus the smelting was frequently a matter of guesswork. Note that these two statements are for 1941, yet probably some of them were still an issue in 1942. Baryatinskiy notes the following. Speaking of T-34 production in 1942 and 1943, mention should be made that in autumn 1942, their quality has been in crisis, an apparent result of the continuous need for making more and more tanks, and involvement of new, non-specific plants in tank production. So in terms of armor protection, the outcome is less clear-cut. The T-34 has the better values, but there were quite many issues. The problem is hard to quantify how strongly they affected the tank. From my current knowledge, I would say it is a minor win for the T-34, but could also be a draw. Next up on the list is mobility. So the quantitative data is rather straightforward here. The Panzer IV G was about 4.1 tons lighter than the T-34 with 25 tons versus 29.1 tons. Yet in all other metrics it was worse off. It was slower, had more ground pressure per area, less horsepower, and although lighter, also significantly worse horsepower per weight ratio. Yet again, there are other elements that reduce the gap between the two. The T-34 had issues with the air filter and cooling system, which limited its capability in summertime. For example, in 1941 to 1943, when the air temperature was above 25 degrees Celsius, the T-34's engine would overheat after 12 minutes running at 400 horsepower. In these conditions, it could continually generate only 315 horsepower, which limited the tank's speed to 30 km per hour. Although the same author notes earlier that the experience had shown that in tank combat, a tank rarely reached its top speed, it still affects the overall performance. Another issue was that the T-34 was harder to drive and required a lot of strength, which is also indicated in the workshop Wednesday Panzer IV Ausf T-34 driving experience from the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum. Yet when it came to cross-country performance, especially in mud and snow, the T-34 was clearly superior. Although the Panzer IV was easier to drive, in overall it had weaker values than the T-34 here. Yet the determining factor that makes the T-34 the clear winner here is the cross-country performance. Because even communists were unable to make Soviet Russia run out of mud and snow, at least so far. Next on the list is crew ergonomics and visibility. One of the main issues of the T-34 was that it only had a 2-man turret, whereas the Panzer IV had a 3-man turret. As such, the T-34 commander was occupied with duties that did not involve spotting and commanding the tank, which further reduced the chances of spotting an enemy, coordination effectiveness with the crew, and other tanks. Zaloga notes, Soviet tank officers complained that the T-34's commander had to be a circus performer, simultaneously directing the crew, aiming the main gun, and instructing the driver. Additionally, the lack of proper vision devices was hard to circumvent, since the T-34 tank's poor hatch design prevented tank commanders from riding with their heads outside of the tank. Which brings us to visibility. There is a clear difference. The Germans used their commander's cupola, which are well known for providing a good all-around vision, well at least for World War II tanks. Only in 1943, the T-34 turrets got the commander's cupola similar to the German tanks, while the 3-man turret was only introduced in 1944 with the T-34-85. Hence, in terms of ergonomics and visibility, the Panzer IV is the clear winner, which means the overall combat effectiveness of the T-34 was severely reduced in many other aspects. So we move to the final element of our analysis, communications. First off, the hard data. The Panzer IV had the FOG-5 radio set 5, which had a range of about 4 to 6 km under good conditions, yet usually noted 2 to 3 km range with voice while driving. Additionally, the Panzer IV also had an intercom system, Bordsprechanlage 20, which interconnected the commander, gunner, radio man, and driver. Note that early in the war the gunner was not connected. For communications between the tanks, the Red Army used the 71 TK3 radio set. The theoretical range stationary was around 25 km and 15 to 18 km in motion depending on the source. The intercom system of the T-34 was limited to the commander and driver. While in theory the Soviet radio set clearly seems better, the problem is that only a limited number of tanks were equipped with them. While in 1941, only 25% of all T-34s had a radio, the protection data for 1943 indicates that the number had risen to 35.9%. The other tanks had to use flags and flares for communication. This was in contrast to German Panzers that usually had at least a receiver, and would thus be able to receive orders, whereas platoon commanders and upwards were equipped with two-way communication. Furthermore, the Soviet radio sets had various shortcomings and did not perform to specifications. For example, the 71 TK3 radio set, although theoretically having a range on the move of up to 15 km, in practice had a range on the move of about 6 km, and was according to one tankers a complex, unreliable radio set. Very often it failed and was very difficult to get it working again. One issue was that the frequency drifted and needed regular training. In October 1940, the Soviet conducted a test of the German radio set and concluded, judging by all basic characteristics, the radio set of the German tank is superior to that installed in the domestic tank. I considered it useful to conduct the design and development of a new tank radio on the basis of the available German models. The issue with the intercom system of the Soviet tanks was similar. It barely worked. As such, the commander and driver used a rather personal way to communicate with each other, which sounds a bit more romantic than it actually was. According to the recollections of a driver mechanic who served in one, communications were handled by feet, which is to say I had the boots of the commander resting on my shoulders. He would push left or right shoulder, which let me know whether to turn left or right, and if he wanted to stop, he tapped my head. As such, in the communications department, the Panzer IV is the clear winner. Before we conclude this video, 2 points, one minor and one major. First, the minor one. In my video where I compared the Panzer III to the T-34 in 1941, some people complained that the comparison was unfair and that I should compare the Panzer IV with the T-34. First off, what is unfair? Second, watching the video before commenting clearly helps. Third, in 1941, the Panzer IV had still the short-barreled 75mm and was also rather rare. This brings us directly to the major point. Ironically, the comparison of the Panzer IV versus the T-34 in 1942 makes only limited sense. Here again, the Panzer III would have made more sense since the Panzer IV was still rather rare. If we look at the number of T-34s produced in 1942 versus the number of Panzer IVs produced in 1942, we see there's a major difference. There were a total of 994 Panzer IV accepted into service. Meanwhile, the Soviets produced 12,521 T-34s. This includes 309 flame tanks. This gives a ratio of 1 Panzer IV to 12.6 T-34s. Oh wait, the number for the Panzer IVs actually includes 107 short-barreled as well. So let's remove those and we get a factor of 1 to 14.1. This is also one of the reasons why I think calling the Panzer IV the workhorse of the Wehrmacht is wrong, since for a long time it was not as common as many think. Even in 1943 at the Battle of Kursk, the Panzer IV with the long-barreled 75mm gun was not standard issue. To quote Dr. Roman Töppel, at Kursk the Panzer IV long was still a luxury for some divisions. Even a favored division like Das Reich had mainly Panzer IIIs. To conclude, generally the Panzer IV is better or almost even than the T-34 in summer/fall 1942 in most aspects. Yet in terms of overall numbers, the situation was quite different. Be sure to use the link in the description and claim War Thunder's large bonus pack for new players and everyone returning that hasn't played for the last 6 months or longer, featuring multiple premium vehicles, premium account time, rentals and a 3D decorator. And don't forget to check out the mobile version. Big thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this episode. Be sure to check out the links in the description. Thank you to Peter Samsonov, Francis Pulham, Roman Töppel and Jentz for helping out with various questions. And of course Andrew for reviewing the script. As always, sources are in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.